Why is it that we're seeing all of these stories of avoidance coming back after a no contact rule?
The no contact rule.
No contact rule.
No contact rule will work 99% of the time.
Exactly why no contact always works.
Well, over the years, I have found it incredibly useful to distill each of the insecure attachment styles down to their core wound. And doing this can actually give us an idea or a direction to head into understanding why the no contact rule tends to be so effective on avoidance in particular. So let's start with the basics. There are 4 core attachment styles: the secure attachment style, the dismissive avoidant attachment style, the anxious attachment style, and the fearful avoidant attachment style. But only 3 of those 4 attachment styles are considered insecure: dismissives, anxious, and fearful avoidance. Now, each of these 3 insecure attachment styles, in my opinion, has a specific core wound. Think of the core wound as the ultimate trigger. When something brushes up against the core wound of an insecure attachment, it will trigger that insecure attachment to become, well, more insecure. So the core wound of a dismissive avoidant often revolves around this fear of losing independence. An anxious person's core wound typically centers on the fear of loss or abandonment. Meanwhile, someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style exhibits both of these core wounds. But we're structuring this entire discussion about dismissive avoidance, specifically as it relates to the no contact rule. And for that, we really need to take the dismissive avoidant core wound and pick it apart and really understand that there's an interesting paradox that lies at the heart of almost every single avoidant. Individuals with this attachment style often emphasize their self-sufficiency and preference for emotional distance. After all, according to page 118 of Attached, avoidance mistakes self-reliance for independence. Yet, despite this, they possess a deep and rich inner life, often filled with fantasies and idealizations of a perfect relationship. Now, this aspect of avoidant behavior is often overshadowed by their outward behavior, which typically showcases the independence and detachment. Yet inside, they're constantly yearning for this idealized version of a relationship, this fantasy life or this fantasy partner. And I think that's what people get wrong about avoidance. Here, I'll prove it to you. This is one of the most popular videos I ever made on avoidance. Take a look at the comments. What's interesting is you're going to notice 2 major themes emerge when you look at these comments. Stay away from avoidance because they will hurt you, and yes, sometimes that can be true. Getting ghosted can absolutely hurt. But then sometimes you'll hear people say, stay away from avoidance because they never want anything serious. And it's this one that I'm not sure I actually agree with, which is a wild thing to say, but hear me out. I think internally, avoidants do want something serious. They want that fantasy, idealized version of a relationship more than anything else. It's just that their childhood has them so warped that they have turned that fantasy into a deactivation strategy. And what I find really interesting about dismissive avoidance is they've often turned that fantasy into this make-believe, idealized, perfect version of a partner that they can't ever seem to get. And a little bit of this is by design. They don't want people to get close to them, so they have this idealized version that they've placed on a pedestal so that no one can ever seem to measure up. And this really plays into that internal fantasy that they have going on here. And this is really where the Phantom X concept kind of comes into play.
They're going to have an ex from their past who they can't get out of their mind. It's called the Phantom X.
Or he compares me with his last ex, whom appeared to have been perfect in every way.
Officially, the Phantom X is a past partner that you can't seem to stop thinking about. So instead, you hyper-focus on them and romanticize your time together.
About the fearful avoidant attachment style and the Phantom X.
So the calling card of this is in relationships when they sense that someone is getting too close, they often become triggered. And part of that triggering involves comparing the partner with this idealized version of the life that they believe that they should have. It really is the ultimate deactivation strategy. The partner they are with never measures up, and it ultimately leads to the dismissive avoidant pushing that partner away. Yet, I think if you were to talk to an avoidant about what's actually going on in their head, they would really sell you on the authenticity of their pursuit for finding the one. They just haven't found the right person yet. For them, they don't look at it like they're deactivating, even though they are. They just look at it like they're on this endless treadmill, this endless pursuit of looking for the perfect partner for them. But the goalposts always move. And the reason I think the goalposts always move is they're always picking out a specific type of individual in their relationships. In polling our audience, we've learned two very important things. Number one, most of the exes that our clients are attempting to get back or get over tend to have dismissive, avoidant characteristics. And number two, most of our clients tend to have anxious, preoccupied characteristics. The crazy part about this pairing is that you couldn't wish for a worst one. The avoidant person has a core wound that revolves around this insatiable need for independence. Meanwhile, the anxious person has a core wound that revolves around this insatiable fear of being abandoned. And here's where we get down to business. In my opinion, the reason that the no contact rule works so well on dismissive avoidance is that it's generally not the approach that most anxious people who go through a breakup or get ghosted will take. You see, anxious individuals, when confronted with a breakup, they try to fix the problem, which ironically causes the avoidant to maintain their defenses. In other words, the anxious person does the opposite of no contact. Now, let's contrast this with how a secure person might react to a breakup. Now, a secure person might grieve a bit at first, maybe act a little anxiously, but then they give the avoidant space. And it's in this space that causes an avoidant to be alone with their thoughts. And that's when the interesting stuff really starts to happen. So why is the no contact rule so effective on avoidance? Well, I think the obvious surface level answer is that once an ex-partner becomes unavailable, either through the end of a relationship or a lack of contact, avoidant individuals usually start to experience suppressed feelings of attachment. Now, according to one of my favorite avoidant resources, freetoattach.com, this shift occurs because their deactivation systems are no longer triggered. There's no interaction with an anxious person or any other kind of partner to trigger them. And this longing for an ex-partner only intensifies when an avoidant fails to establish an emotional bond with new partners. And this often occurs well after the initial relationship has become stale. So in my mind, there are two criteria that truly explain why the no contact rule is so effective. Number one, you have to leave the avoidant alone, which obviously the no contact rule addresses. And number two, they need to realize that the dating landscape out there without you is pretty barren. Now, when these two criteria are met, that's when the avoidant allows themselves to reminisce and feel nostalgia. Now, I've pointed this out in multiple videos that I've done. Avoidants are free to long for an ex once that ex is out of communication and out of contact. Basically, that ex is unavailable. And really, I've used this as like my calling card to clients to basically teach them that instead of trying to get your ex back, which you so desperately want to do, the best way to achieve that goal is to actually use a no contact rule and try to get over your ex during that no contact rule. Now, most people don't take this advice. They think they know better, yet it does work. But don't take it just from me. Take a look at some of our success stories. But there are other elements, in my opinion, that can make the no contact rule such an effective strategy to use on an avoidant. Let's start with the obvious one. There's this idealization of a past relationship. As I mentioned, avoidants all have these inner fantasies about how things are supposed to be and how they're supposed to feel. Now, part of this is a deactivation strategy. They use it to keep you at an arm's length. However, with time and distance, avoidants might start to idealize the past relationship, remembering only the positive aspects. This selective memory can cause them down the road to be interested in rekindling things with you. I'm actually going to talk a lot about this later in the video with the peak end rule, so stick around for that. But for now, let's move on to the second big thing. There's this element of a changed perspective. Now, we are often slaves to our thoughts, feelings, experiences, etc. I've noticed that a lot of my clients act incredibly anxiously after a breakup, which if you look at the polls is not exactly a shock. Where it really gets clients in trouble though is they're often breaking the no contact rule constantly. Look at this. This is an interview I did with Sophie, and by her own admission, she did literally everything wrong.
I'm not doing that.
So you're out of no contact at this point?
My first one, yes, and then I'm trying to remember. I think I broke no contact.
Now this behavior, especially when dealing with an avoidant, causes them to put up walls. And when they have these walls put up, it causes them to form a specific perception about the person who they put the walls up to guard from. But what if you were to do the opposite? What if instead of begging and breaking the no contact rule consistently, you implemented the no contact rule and stuck to it? This could change an avoidant's perspective of how they expected you to react. After all, an ex-partner moving on and becoming unavailable suddenly causes the avoidant to put their walls down. The avoidant no longer fears getting close to the anxious person or their past partner, and their unavailability removes the immediate risk of engulfment, making the ex-partner seem ultimately more desirable. Yet the one consistent theme that emerges when researching why the no contact rule is so effective on avoidance has a lot to do with this anxious and avoidant dynamic. As I said earlier, our average client tends to have an anxious attachment style, while our average client's ex tends to have an avoidant attachment style. And I think this dynamic is really a core function into understanding how the no contact rule works with the avoidant mentality. Let's pull out Attached again. On page 157 of Attached, Amir Levine and Rachel S.F. Heller explained that people in anxious avoidant relationships find it particularly hard to move towards security, primarily because they are trapped in a cycle of exacerbating each other's insecurities. All right, you know I have to do it. Let's take a look at the avoidant death wheel. Now, I talk about the avoidant death wheel in pretty much every single attachment related discussion I've ever had on this YouTube channel. And really, the death wheel is meant to help you understand the dynamic behind how avoidants in general operate in relationships. There are 8 main stages to it. The desiring love stage, which basically has them starting off wanting someone to love them. And it really correlates to that internal fantasy that we were talking about. This idealization of this perfect relationship that they've never been able to achieve before. Stage 2, of course, is the honeymoon period. They start dating someone new, they enter a relationship and experience this brief idealization phase where they think they have finally found the one. Then stage 3, things start to go downhill. They start noticing some worrying signs. Concerns arise. This often triggers their deactivation strategies and causes them to get more anxious. Stage 4 is where they start thinking of leaving the relationship. Not a ton to dive into there. They just start thinking of leaving. Typically, you'll notice that their partner starts doubling down, trying to figure out what's wrong. The avoidant doesn't really talk much about it. And then stage 5, they actually do leave the relationship. A breakup ends up occurring. Stage 6 is the separation elation stage. Remember, a core wound of an avoidant has a lot to do with this need for independence. Well, they've just gotten their independence back, and so they're elated by this fact. Stage 7 is loneliness and self-pity. They start to feel lonely, then they feel sorry for themselves, which often leads to a depression. And then stage 8, basically the cycle repeats. It leads them back to the beginning, and around we go. But here's something that a lot of people don't talk about or think about when it comes to the death wheel. The anxious person also has their own death wheel. So the anxious death wheel starts essentially the exact same way that the avoidant death wheel starts. And really, it starts to diverge around stage 3. So where the avoidant starts noticing some worrying signs, the anxious person, instead of noticing those worrying signs, becomes completely codependent on the avoidant. They focus overly too much on them. This causes the avoidant to put the walls up, and stage 4 then commence. They start doubling down when they sense a potential breakup about to occur. Then stage 5, they ultimately get left by the avoidant. Then stage 6, they do everything they can to win the avoidant back. And that is where most of the people watching this video are probably in right now. And ultimately, this is where they fail to implement the no contact rule, which often exacerbates the situation. Attached discusses this really fascinating study, which is an experiment that has a lot to do with separating rat pups from their rat mothers. It was conducted by Myron Hoffer of Columbia University. What he found was that basically when rat pups are separated from their mothers, a number of physiological responses can occur. Number one, their activity level goes down. Number two, their heart rate goes down. And number three, so does their growth hormone level. So here's what Hoffer decided to do. He decided that he was going to gradually replace every maternal attribute with a substitute. So he decided he was going to warm the rat pups with a heating pad. He was going to feed them so their stomachs were full. He was going to pat them with a brush to imitate mother licking them. And what he found is that each intervention helped only one aspect of their separation anxiety. The only thing that helped alleviate all the symptoms at once was a reunion with their mothers. Human attachment works similarly. After a breakup, our attachment system will go into overdrive. We're going to yearn to have the anxiety that we're feeling fixed. And in my opinion, this is what happens during stage 6 of the anxious death wheel. An anxious person instinctually understands that the only way they can alleviate all of the anxiety, depression, stress that they're feeling after this breakup is to reunite with that ex, because that will take care of the whole thing at once. The result?
I think I did everything wrong though. I had, confrontation with the other woman. I had,
it's interesting.
drama
So
with
we're
the
seeing the
friend.
anxious behaviors sort of take root here,
Yeah. I went full panic because I didn't know what to do. And he was pretty upset with me for that. I thought it was genius. I was like, I'll stay in his life by being invited to everything by his friends. And he was so pissed about that. He was like, I need time. So he reached out to me about a month after the breakup.
Here's perhaps the worst part of the anxious death wheel. This inability to ultimately implement a no contact rule leads to a lot of negative self-talk. So by the time you get to stages 7 and 8 in that anxious death wheel, it's not going so well, I feel so alone, will I ever find someone? You've broken down so much that you start actually believing you're the problem. You start with all of this negative self-talk. That's why, in my mind, doing the no contact rule is so important. The key though is you need to do the no contact rule not to try to get your ex back, but to try to actually get over them, which has the weird benefit of making the ex potentially want you back, but also it helps prevent that negative self-talk. On page 162 of Attached, there's an interesting quote. In conflicts, the anxious person often loses more ground. In intense disputes between anxious and avoidant partners without secure checks and balances, those with anxious attachment styles tend to be overwhelmed by negative emotions. When hurt, they may react in extreme ways, including threatening to leave, a behavior known as protest behavior. This actually corresponds with stages 3 and 4 of the anxious death wheel, in case you were wondering. However, once they calm down, an anxious person is flooded with positive memories and regret. This often leads them to reach out to the avoidant partner for a reconciliation. Now, this attempt is often met with hostility from avoidant partners who, in contrast, shut off attachment-related memories and recall only the worst aspects of their partner. This dynamic results in a chaotic situation where, after a conflict, the anxious partner remembers the good times, while the avoidant partner dwells on the bad. However, there is a counter argument to this. With sufficient time apart, such as during a no contact rule, avoidants, you may find, shift their negative thoughts about their ex towards more positive ones, assuming they're left alone. And this phenomenon really aligns a lot with the peak end rule. Now, if you're not familiar, the peak end rule is something you definitely should learn about. In a nutshell, basically it suggests that an event is remembered not by the entirety of the experience, but by significant moments or snapshots, the peak moments and the end moments. Avoidants, if they're not given space, tend to focus on those end negative moments, specifically towards the end of the relationship. However, with the implementation of a no contact rule and the passage of time, you may find that they gradually start reminiscing about the peak moments, much like the anxious individuals who, after a conflict, tend to focus on the positive memories. And the research supports this. You give an avoidant enough space, an environment they perceive as non-threatening, they start to fantasize about their ex-partner. And this is why I tend to advocate for longer periods of the no contact rule for anyone who's trying it out for the first time. I actually interviewed a therapist a few weeks ago named Julia Christina, where I asked her point blank how long she thought a no contact rule should be.
Okay, so I'm basing this off of science in other areas, but I'm going to say 90 days.
Okay.
When you think about 90 days is the probationary period at a new job, that's how long it takes, to kind of get your handle on what's going on in a new job, to start feeling settled, understand what's happening when it's, that whole level of newness.
So she thinks 90 days. But I believe in a little bit more of a flexible approach. I think of it as 45-day check-ins with yourself. So you start out thinking, I'm gonna do the no contact rule for 45 days. And during those 45 days, I'm gonna do everything I can to try to get over my ex. And after those 45 days are up, if you feel you're in a place emotionally where you are over your ex, then you can try to maybe reach out to them. If you're not in a place where you feel like you're not ready to contact your ex or you're not over them, then it's maybe time to extend the no contact period another 45 days.